going to talk a little bit about the state of the tropics. We like to start off with the look at the SST just to kind of see what the large scale setup is, like usual. So we still have kind of this general negative ENSO, so cool neutral, maybe trying to trend towards La Nina. We've seen some upwelling here in the Central Pacific, and so pretty cool East Pacific. Very warm North Pacific here off of Japan. So kind of the extratropics are very warm across the globe, especially in the Pacific. So if we go look over in the Atlantic, we've seen some warming kind of here along the northern MDR and in the southwest Atlantic. A little bit of cooling at higher latitudes. So it's not really what I would say a classic warm ammo horseshoe, kind of a muddled mixed look, but it's been trending a little bit more positive in terms of the Atlantic SST anomalies. We do have this sort of cool tongue off of the Gulf of Guinea off Africa here, which is a sort of an Atlantic Nina signature. That can sort of hinder some of the storms trying to get going way out here in the eastern Atlantic. So just something to think about as we go into the rest of the year. I tend to think we're going to be favored kind of in this western and southwest Atlantic region for development and intensification, but we'll see as we get further into the season. So just looking at where we are across the globe, right now the Pacific is still mostly favored, and we'll look at the MJO in a second and why that is. In terms of satellite pictures, we had Hurricane Iona, and then Kelly following it now. This is Tropical Storm Gil, and it's going to be moving off to the west and northwest here. And we're also expecting another system or two to eventually fire off down here to the south of Mexico. So just briefly on Gil, again, it's forecast to move off to the west-northwest and then eventually dissipate after some intensification. Probably will become a hurricane, at least briefly. But if you look at the water, it's going to be basically kind of moving up into this cooler water. If you remember, about 26 Celsius or 80 Fahrenheit, that's about what you need to support a hurricane. And so it's going to be getting well north of that into waters that are just too cool to support hurricanes. And so even if it does approach Hawaii, it should weaken to very little by the time it gets close. In the Atlantic, things are just very dry, not much convection right now. This is that wave we had talked about a little bit last week. There's just not much thunderstorm activity with it. It's a pretty large, broad wave. You can see kind of the signature there moving off to the northwest, but doesn't really look to be developing at all. Things may start to change a little bit over the next week or two. This is velocity potential, so the areas of rising and sinking air, the anomalies. So you can see right now, again, we're sort of over the Pacific right here, but this is starting to propagate east. And so as we get toward the first or second week of August, you're going to see a lot more rising motion over Africa and the Indian Ocean. And this tends to favor the Atlantic. So as we get into mid-August, things should become a little bit more favorable. And if you think back to the MJO structure, you can kind of see why. After the MJO passes, you have low-level westerly anomalies, and then upward motion brings a lot of moisture in, and then you have upper-level easterlies. And so in the Atlantic, what that looks like is you get this big surge of upper-level easterly winds. And remember, in the Atlantic, typically the one of the biggest hindrances is this this westerly shear across the western part of the basin. But with this big MJO surge, what we actually have is the so-called TEJ, tropical easterly jet out of Africa, is enhanced. So you have this big, strong surge of upper-level easterlies. And so if you look, the upper-level westerlies are pushed way up here to like 30 north. So there's basically no no tropical upper tropospheric trough, just a big area of light and favorable upper-level winds across the basin by the time we get to mid-August. So you'd think that would favor a decent bit of hurricane activity, and then you could see in the anomalies that that's the case as well, a lot lower shear than usual. So again, just based on the upper level winds, you'd expect quite a bit of tropical development. But as FSU alum and college game day host Lee Corsi used to say, not so fast, my friend, and that's going to be this dry air coming in from the northeast. That's may not totally prevent development, but this is definitely a hindrance to development. You kind of have this positive NAO pattern with a high pressure up here, sending this dry air down into the basin. And so even though the shear is low, this dry air is going to suppress thunderstorm development, and so it's going to be a little bit of a trick to see which of these effects wins out. But we saw this dry air pattern last year, and so as it comes in down into the MDR, it can really suppress development. So just because we have the low shear, I don't think it's going to be a guarantee that we're going to have a big hurricane outbreak just yet. Another way of looking at this is these nice time series, basically of the how the shear and different parameters are evolving relative to climatology. If you remember back in July, we were well above average, but actually the shear has already started to come down. We're below average down in the Caribbean. And like I said, I think this is going to come down even more as we get in the MJO passage. So in terms of shear, the Atlantic is looking quite favorable. But if you look at some of the other things, the water vapor, this is basically where negative is more water vapor, positive is drier. So we've basically since the start of the season, we've been drier than usual. And like I said, that looks to continue for a bit based on the model forecasts. And also stability. Stability is basically a measure of how easy it is for air to rise. And for clouds, thunderstorms, you want low stability. So this is actually kind of the inverse of stability and instability. So you want this metric to be higher to be able to get deep tropical convection. But this metric has been running below normal for basically the whole season, and kind of well below normal. And so that's part of why we see this dry and hostile environment with not much deep convection. So it really doesn't matter if the shear is low if you can't get any deep convection. So we'll have to see if this changes at all as the MJO passes as well. There is a little bit of signal on some of the ensembles, around day 10. It looks like something's going to come off and maybe try to develop here out in the Central Atlantic. But again, it's going to be battling that dry air. If you look at the GFS ensemble, kind of the same idea. One thing I will note is it does look like we have a decent amount of high pressure up over the U.S., such that, if anything does get in the Southwest Atlantic here, it probably needs to be watched. And certainly if something does develop, the upper level winds are quite favorable for intensification in this sort of 1 to 2 week range. But I think it really remains to be seen if we're going to be able to get anything to actually start, given the dry air instability. One other thing I wanted to note is, if you remember, we talked a little bit about some of these AI models that are being tested this year. And if you remember that one of them was this, the Google DeepMind, which NHC is testing. And earlier this week and last week, it was showing that wave near the islands that I was telling you about. It was showing it developing into a tropical storm, even hurricane, about 9 days out over the Southwest Atlantic. It was pretty aggressive with it. But now go a few days later, this is as of this afternoon, for the same valid time, 6 days out, very little signal for it. So just something to keep in mind. These models they're being tested, they're new, and it looks like maybe sort of this version is a little too aggressive on development of tropical cyclones. And so, once we see some signal show up in our more traditional models like the Euro and GFS and those ensembles, I think that'll be a better signal that we're actually looking at tropical development happening. So they'll be good to keep evaluating this, but for now I would take these with a serious grain of salt. Lastly, I just want to point out where we are. We're in the last day of July, heading August, so this is sort of when we start to see a ramp up, but really the big ramp up in Atlantic activity doesn't come until mid to late August. And so the Atlantic peak is very, very sharp late August and September. So it's another reason why I think this initial MGO pulse is going to kind of be in this range and may get some activity, but I think what we're really seeing the ramp up is probably closer to our traditional later August peak and into September. So we'll see. Just keep an eye on things. Certainly nothing imminent, but we'll keep watching and hope everyone enjoyed and stay safe.